The town of Black Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, was a place where time seemed to stand still. Its cobblestone streets, weathered by centuries of rain and snow, whispered secrets of the past. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of the old cemetery on the hill, where the graves were said to hold more than just bones. They called it Restless Hill, and no one dared to visit after sundown, except for one man. Ethan Cross was a photographer with a reputation for chasing the macabre. His work had taken him to abandoned asylums, cursed forests and forgotten battlefields, but Black Hollow was different. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the way the mist clung to the ground like a shroud. It was the legend of the coffin camera. The story went like this. In the late 1800s, a traveling photographer named Silas Graves arrived in Black Hollow. He was a peculiar man, always dressed in black, with a camera so ancient it looked like it belonged in a museum. Silas claimed his camera could capture the souls of the dead, preserving them forever in his photographs. The townsfolk laughed at first, but when Silas began photographing the recently deceased, strange things started happening. People swore they saw the dead moving in his pictures, their eyes following you no matter where you stood. Then one night, Silas disappeared, leaving behind his camera and a trail of unanswered questions. Ethan had heard the legend 100 times, but it wasn't until he found the camera in a dusty antique shop that he decided to investigate. The shopkeeper, an old woman with eyes like cracked glass, warned him not to take it. "That camera's cursed," she said, her voice trembling. "It don't take pictures of the living. Only the dead." Ethan laughed it off, paid the woman, and left with the camera tucked under his arm. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in stories. And this one was too good to pass up. The sun was setting as Ethan climbed Restless Hill, the camera slung over his shoulder. The cemetery was exactly as he'd imagined. Crumbling headstones, gnarled trees, and an air of quiet dread. He set up his tripod near the oldest section, where the graves were so weathered the names had faded into obscurity. The coffin camera, as he'd come to call it, was heavier than it looked, its brass fittings tarnished with age. He adjusted the lens, the aperture clicking into place like the ticking of a clock. Ethan had no intention of photographing the dead. He was here to capture the atmosphere, the way the moonlight filtered through the trees, the way the shadows seemed to move on their own. But as he peered through the viewfinder, something caught his eye. A figure standing between the graves, barely visible in the fading light. Ethan froze. He hadn't heard anyone approach. The figure was tall, dressed in a long coat, its face obscured by the brim of a hat. Ethan's heart pounded as he adjusted the focus, the figure coming into sharper view. And then, just as he was about to take the shot, it vanished. Ethan lowered the camera, his hands trembling. He scanned the cemetery, but there was no one there. Just the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. He told himself it was a trick of the light, his imagination playing tricks on him. But deep down he knew better. He developed the photo that night in his makeshift darkroom, the red light casting an eerie glow over the walls. As the image began to take shape, his breath caught in his throat. The figure was there, clear as day, standing between the graves. But it wasn't a person. Not exactly. Its face was a blur, like it had been smeared across the photograph, and its coat seemed to melt into the shadows. Ethan stared at the photo, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He'd seen enough ghost stories to know when something wasn't right. The next morning, Ethan returned to the cemetery, determined to uncover the truth. He spent hours examining the graves, looking for any clue that might explain what he'd seen. It wasn't until he reached the far corner of the cemetery that he found it, a headstone so weathered it was almost unrecognizable. He knelt down, brushing away the moss and dirt, and felt his blood run cold. The name etched into the stone was Silas Graves. Ethan's mind raced. Was it possible? Could the figure in the photo be Silas himself, trapped in the camera he'd created? He didn't have time to ponder the question. As he stood up, he heard a sound behind him, a low, guttural whisper like the wind through a hollow tree. He turned, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the camera sitting on its tripod, the lens pointed directly at him. And then, without warning, the shutter clicked. The sound of the shutter echoed in Ethan's ears like a gunshot. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over a broken headstone. The camera stood motionless, its lens gleaming in the pale sunlight. For a moment, he thought he saw something move inside it, a flicker of darkness like a shadow passing through glass. He shook his head, trying to clear the image from his mind. It was just his imagination. Had to be. But as he packed up his equipment and left the cemetery, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the sky. The wind carried whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices from another world. Ethan quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was just the stress, the lack of sleep, but deep down he knew something was wrong. That night, Ethan developed the photo the camera had taken. He worked in silence, the red light of the darkroom casting long shadows on the walls. As the image began to take shape, his hands trembled. The photo showed the cemetery just as he'd seen it, but there was something else. A figure standing in the background, its face a blur of shadows. Ethan leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. The figure wasn't alone. Behind it, barely visible in the darkness, were dozens of others, their faces twisted in agony. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen enough to know that this wasn't just a trick of the light. The camera was capturing something real, something dangerous. The next morning, Ethan returned to the antique shop where he'd found the camera. The old woman was gone, the shop empty and dark. He searched the shelves, looking for anything that might explain what was happening, but found nothing. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small box tucked away in the corner. Inside was a collection of old photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. They showed the same cemetery, the same shadowy figures, their faces twisted in pain. At the bottom of the box was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. Ethan opened it, his hands trembling, and began to read. The journal belonged to Silas Graves. In it, he described his experiments with the camera, his attempts to capture the souls of the dead. He wrote of the whispers he heard in the cemetery, the figures he saw moving in the shadows. He believed the camera was a gateway, a way to communicate with the other side. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, the figures more aggressive. Silas realized too late that he'd unleashed something he couldn't control. The final entry was written in a shaky hand, the ink smeared as if by tears. "They're coming for me. They want the camera. They want to be free."
Ethan closed the journal, his mind racing. He didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear: the camera was more than just a tool. It was a prison, holding the souls of the dead. And now, it had its sights set on him. That night, Ethan returned to the cemetery, the camera slung over his shoulder. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to find answers. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the graves. He set up the camera near Silas's headstone, the lens pointed at the spot where he'd seen the figure the day before. As he adjusted the focus, he heard a sound behind him, a low, guttural whisper, like the wind through a hollow tree. He turned, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the shadows, stretching and twisting in the moonlight. Ethan took a deep breath and pressed the shutter. The camera clicked, the sound echoing through the cemetery. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the air grew cold, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder, icy and lifeless. He spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers turned to screams, the shadows closing in around him. He grabbed the camera and ran, the sound of footsteps echoing behind him. He didn't stop until he reached his car, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, the figures, standing in the road, their faces twisted in agony. They were real. And they were coming for him. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The rearview mirror reflected nothing but empty road now, but the image of those figures, those things, burned in his mind. Their hollow eyes, their twisted mouths frozen in silent screams. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. The camera sat on the passenger seat, its brass fittings glinting in the dim light of the dashboard. It felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of the souls it had trapped. He drove straight to his rented cabin on the edge of town, a small, creaking structure that seemed to groan under the weight of its own history. The moment he stepped inside, he locked the door and drew the curtains, though he knew it wouldn't matter. If those things wanted in, no lock would stop them. He set the camera on the table and stared at it, his mind racing. The journal, the photos, the whispers, it all pointed to one thing. The camera wasn't just a tool. It was a curse. And he had awakened it. Ethan spent the next few hours poring over Silas Graves' journal, searching for answers. The entries grew more frantic as the pages turned, the handwriting devolving into jagged scrawls. Silas wrote of the camera's hunger, its insatiable need to capture souls. He described the figures he saw in the photos, how they seemed to grow more vivid, more alive, with each exposure. And then, the final entry. They've found me. They're in the walls. They're in the shadows. They're in the camera. God help me, they're in the camera. Ethan slammed the journal shut, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He needed to destroy the camera. He needed to end this. But as he reached for it, the room grew cold, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The whispers began again, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from outside. They were coming from the camera. He stumbled back, his heart pounding as the camera's shutter clicked on its own. The sound was deafening in the silence of the cabin. Ethan watched in horror as the lens focused on him, the aperture narrowing like the pupil of an eye. He tried to move, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and chaotic, each one pleading, demanding, screaming. "Let us out!" they hissed. "Let us out!" Ethan's vision blurred as the room seemed to tilt and spin. Shadows pulled at the edges of his sight, stretching and twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. He felt hands on his shoulders, icy and skeletal, pulling him toward the camera. He fought against them, but they were too strong. The lens loomed larger, a black void that seemed to swallow the light. And then, with a final, deafening click, everything went dark. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was no longer in the cabin. He stood in the cemetery, the moon casting an eerie glow over the graves. The camera was in his hands, its weight familiar yet foreign. He tried to move, to scream, but his body wasn't his own. He was a passenger, trapped in a nightmare. The whispers surrounded him, the figures emerging from the shadows. They were clearer now, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They reached for him, their fingers brushing against his skin, and he felt their pain, their anger, their despair. They wanted freedom, and they would take it from him. Ethan raised the camera, his hands moving against his will. The lens focused on the figures, the aperture clicking into place. He tried to fight it, to drop the camera, but it was no use. The shutter clicked, and the figures froze, their faces contorted in silent screams. The camera shuddered in his hands, the film winding on its own. And then silence. The cemetery was empty now, the figures gone. But Ethan knew they weren't truly free. They were trapped in the camera, just as he was. He felt their presence, their voices echoing in his mind. They were a part of him now, and he was a part of them. As he stumbled out of the cemetery, the camera slung over his shoulder, he realized the truth. The camera wasn't just a prison for the dead. It was a gateway, a bridge between worlds. And he had crossed it. Ethan's story didn't end there. He became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of Black Hollow. Some say he still wanders the cemetery, the camera in his hands, capturing the souls of the unwary. Others say he's trapped in the camera itself, his face one of the many blurred figures in its photos. But one thing is certain. The American coffin camera is still out there, waiting for its next victim. And if you hear the whispers, if you feel the cold touch of unseen hands, it's already too late. The camera has found you. Subscribe for more chilling tales from the shadows of history.